Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to get logged in. It's good to see everyone here today.
Check to make sure everyone weathered the snowstorm yesterday.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started so I can be mindful of everyone's time today. My name is Egypt Lloyd, along with my father, Dennis Lloyd. And for everyone that's joining us for the first time, this is our second SLHC meeting for 2024. And just to familiarize everyone with the SLHC, we are a platform that is established to help connect the spokes on the wheel of history of enslaved people and their descendants pre and post emancipation. Today, we are excited about our two-time speaker, Kyera Singleton. This will be her second time speaking with us today, and we are honored to have her today. But before I introduce her, I would like to turn her over to Naomi, our program coordinator, who will give you an update on our announcements. So Naomi, I will turn it over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. So first things first, I'm just going to quickly go over the upcoming presenters, especially with next month. Next month is special because we have a hybrid meeting. So let me pull that. Yes, so next month on the 13th, we have a hybrid meeting with Mass Historical Society. SLHC is providing round-trip transportation from Christchurch in Harvard Square. I will shortly share the link to reserve that transportation. There are limited seats, so if you're at all interested, please sort that out as soon as possible. Really excited for this event. If you are meeting us but not utilizing our transportation, we just ask that you arrive no later than 10:15. And then in April, we have Paula Bagger speaking. She is former president of the Hingham Historical Society. And then in June, we have Hidden Jamaica Plain. For other announcements, we have a job posting, which is a joint internship between SLHC and Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. It is actually my previous position. So if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you, Emily. The deadline is actually tomorrow, I think 11:59. So please share with any folks you think might be interested. And then other events this month, Hidden Brookline has several Black History Month events this month. All month, they have a special exhibit on Roland Hayes and Florida Ridley at Village Library, which features work by the Young Scholars, a Black and Latin affinity group from the Hayes School. And then the next event on the 21st, from 1 to 2 p.m. is a Hidden Brookline talk by Barbara Brown, titled The Trailblazing Lives of Florida Ridley and Roland Hayes, which will be at the Senior Center on Winchester Street. And then that's all from me. I will pass it back to Egypt to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi. Great. So yes, we are excited today for our speaker, Kyera Singleton. She is the executive director at the Royall House Enslaved Quarters in Medford. If you have not had the chance to stop by, I highly recommend that. Today, she is going to share her time with us again for the second time to speak about the Boston Slavery exhibit at Faneuil Hall that opened up in June of 2023, which she co-curated. So we are looking forward to your presentation today, Kyera. She will give time for Q&A at the end. So I encourage everyone after her presentation to enter your question into the chat and we will get those questions answered for you today. So Kyera, thank you again for honoring us with your time, and we're looking forward to your presentation, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you everyone for having me. I'm really excited to get to talk to you all about the Boston and slavery exhibit at Faneuil Hall. The exhibit, I think, has been very well received and also a very long time in the making. And I'm just really still ecstatic that I was able to participate in it. So thank you all for inviting me. The co-curators, Dr. Jared Hardesty, and also Joe Bagley couldn't be here today, but I'm going to talk about all of the work that's gone into it, kind of walk you through a portion of the exam, pull out a few of the stories of enslaved people, and then kind of end with thinking about the legacies of slavery today, how we also tie that to a larger Black radical protest tradition in the city of Boston and also throughout Massachusetts, which I think is like one of the main driving forces of how we should be contextualizing this history. While it's important to talk about the past, we also want to make sure we're always engaging with how the past informs the present. And that was really integral to how we thought about the exhibit, how we created the exhibit, and how we made the decisions that we've made in the exhibit. So I'm just going to pull up a PowerPoint and then we will get started. So just bear with me for 1 second. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Are we all good?
I think it's still loading.
1 second, my screen sharing is paused. All right, let's try that again. Is it coming up? Still no?
See, it says started sharing, but I don't see anything as of yet.
You just had it up too.
I know, just had it up. Okay, let me just troubleshoot this for 1 second, maybe.
Okay. Yeah.
No problem.
While you're doing that, maybe I can just mention a couple of upcoming events which we're working on. And as we all know, and the explosion of the Challenger, where several of our astronauts were lost, and among them was a brother by the name of Ron McNair, who was a good friend, and his family is our friends. So his brother Carl McNair will in the future be making a presentation about Ron and his journey, to become an astronaut, which I think will be very exciting, because as we walk the road of the legacy of slavery, it's also pre and post emancipation, and so we do want to talk about some of the figures that have come and gone, unfortunately too early. Also, we're going to we plan to have a presentation from someone who I met here in Atlanta, who is a writer for a local newspaper, and his ancestry is associated with the Confederacy. So he's going to present on the Confederacy, and I think which will be a different spin on what we usually hear, but I think will be quite interesting. And so we're working on putting that together. But those are anticipated presentations that we will have in the future here. In addition to our upcoming trip to the Massachusetts Historical Society, which Naomi mentioned is a hybrid presentation. So we will be live on our virtual, but we'll also have a bus available, which we will park. I noticed Ted and Richard, I haven't asked the Christ Church, can we park the bus in front of their church, as people come And so hello, Julia. So I do need to come in, but we would just be parking there for a moment and we'd gather there. That's just a central location. Anyway, that will be on March 13th. So we're looking forward to that. And then we'll see how Kyera is doing. And
all right, I just closed it and opened it back again. So let's see if this works this time.
Mhm.
Is it there?
It's there.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Awesome.
You know, even though we've been doing this whole Zoom presentations for a while, it still gets me a little flustered.
Yeah.
Okay, can you all see? I just want to make sure that it's
Well, it's loading right
Yes.
now. Kyera.
it's loading.
Mhm.
It's loading.
Okay.
Hmm.
But it's still not showing up.
No.
Kyera,
Yes.
could I suggest you leave somebody else to the technology and that you
Yeah.
just start talking?
Naomi,
Yeah.
how about, can I send you the link? Can I share it with you?
Yeah, share me the link and let's see if I can share it.
Yeah, it worked during our check-in. So I am a little shocked. Okay, hold on one second. I'm just going to send this over to you right now.
Well,
Thank you
it's,
everyone for your
you know,
patience.
It's good to see so many people while we're doing this. Robin, good, always. Louise, Dr. Gibson, Ken, Mayor Reeves, good to see you. And Christian, all the way from California, live. And Deborah, Dorothy. I don't want to, so many people here. And Miss Gavalt, good to see you. And Dorothy and Louise and, Barbara Brown, of course, and Ted and Emily, everyone. So we're excited. And Dorothy, how are you doing? And good. So again, and we're Paula, thank you. Good to saw Paula this morning. Thank you for the shout out. We're some of you, if you just come on, we are experiencing a moment of technical difficulty, which we will overcome in a minute, hopefully. And here it comes. Please.
So it's working for you, Naomi, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Can you?
So you
Great.
can just say next slide and
Okay, that'll be perfect. If you could put it in presenter view, that would be great.
for that you go to view.
Yeah, view, and then it should say presenter view. If not, it'll be fine.
I'm gonna leave it at this.
Okay. Okay, so we're gonna do this introduction again. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you, Naomi, for stepping in and getting the PowerPoint up and running. So I am really excited to talk to you all about the Faneuil Hall exhibit, the Boston Slavery at Faneuil Hall. The co-curators of the exhibit were Joe Bagley, who is the City of Boston's chief archaeologist, Dr. Jared Hardesty, and myself, along with the different project writers, Nadia Klein from the City of Boston's archaeology team, Lauren Sharp as well from the City of Boston's archaeology team, and Jacob Garfinkel, who is a master's student of Jared Hardesty's. There were a bunch of project advisors on the exhibit, two in particular, Dr. Jane Becker, who is the Director of Public History at UMass Boston, and Dr. David Landon, who is the Associate Director of the Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research at UMass Boston as well. And then I want to give a shout out to Laura Roberts, who also pulled me into the project, and she really did handle the community engagement aspect of the exhibit. We had several community meetings, both in person and then also on Zoom, to bring in different scholars, community activists, local historians, genealogists, just broad community members to talk about the history of slavery in Boston, to really think about what should be in the exhibit, what shouldn't be in the exhibit, what we couldn't actually leave out of the exhibit, but also to think about the contours of how do you tell a story in Faneuil Hall. The exhibit spans 2 floors, and so it's not a lot of space. So thinking about how can you tell that story in the space given and make it as comprehensive as possible, as well as impactful as possible. So Naomi, if you could go to the next slide, please. Here are 2 images of us, the team at the ribbon cutting ceremony in June with Mayor Wu. And if you can see on the side, you see Joe Bagley showing both Byron Russian and also Mayor Wu some of the archaeology that was out on display. And so one of the things that I think was really important was when you come into the exhibit, one of the first things that you see actually are the stories of people. And then we go into the context of the history of slavery in Boston. And so really beginning with people and also ending with people as a way to not only memorialize the lives of the enslaved Black and Indigenous people, but also to think about the ways in which community members connect with this history today and to tie it to a larger framework of slavery, freedom, and resistance. Can you go to the next slide as well? Thank you. So I just wanted to give you a snapshot so that you can see into the space. So this is the first floor, so you can kind of see the panels when you walk in, and they wrap around, and then you go downstairs and you continue the exhibit. So there are a lot of different themes that the exhibit engages. Several of them are complicity, labor, resistance, and legacy. And so the ultimate, focus of the exhibit was to really think about Boston's role in slavery through stories, documents, and objects, to reveal the lives of individual enslaved people, their persistence, also their communities, their fight for freedom, and how that struggle of freedom continues today, and really thinking about the different contestations of freedom from the 17th century all the way to our current day now. We use laws and policies to really think about how the institution of slavery forms, and then also how the institution of slavery is maintained, which I think is a really crucial and important part. It really gets into the complicity. So who are the enslavers? How are they profiting from slavery in Boston? What institutions are profiting off of slavery in Boston? And quite frankly, to really show how pervasive slavery was in Boston. One of the other things that I think is really also the highlight is that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is to not only think about the past, but really think about how the past impacts us today. So if you go to the next slide, you'll just continue to see the exhibit panels, kind of how we move through to tell the story. Next slide. On free and unpaid labor, again, how we're moving through. And then the next slide, please. And then kind of how you can actually just end it here, actually. You can keep it here, how we're also talking and asking different questions about the exhibit to the viewers so that we could collect information and kind of keep the conversation going. So I wanted to start here because archaeology is so central to the exhibit. So when Joe Bagley proposed the exhibit, it was to use a lot of the archaeology that was found at a dig at Faneuil Hall. And I think one of the things that really came out to us during the community conversations was, where do we begin? And we knew that we couldn't actually start any story about the history of slavery in Boston without talking about Indigenous communities and also Native enslavement. So by the 1700s, there were more than 1,000 enslaved Africans and Natives living in New England. You have over the next 6 decades, that enslaved population grows dramatically and becomes overwhelmingly African. Between the 1630s and the 1760s, more than 17,000 enslaved Africans arrive in New England. However, we wanted to start at the beginning with thinking about Native enslavement because you have during Metacom's Rebellion, also known as King Philip's War of 1675, really thinking about how English settlers kind of captured and also enslaved Native people from the Massachusetts tribe, from the Wampanoag tribe, and from the Nipmuc nations in order to really kind of turn Boston into a burgeoning epicenter of slavery. And one of the things that, you know, I always like to think about is when you're thinking about English settlers coming in and enslaving populations, what better way than to steal people's land? Well, that is to enslave them and also trade them away. And so we know that some of the earliest—
Sorry.
Okay, some of the first people who are taken to the Caribbean to trade for enslaved Africans are actually Indigenous folks. And so it's really important to start with that story, and then kind of we move through the thinking about the body of liberties and really thinking about how there is a myth that Massachusetts, you know, is the land of revolution, the land of freedom, but that is a real 19th century story. Actually, the 17th and 18th century story is embedded with the history of slavery. And so when we're doing that work and really talking about these histories, really wanting to not shy away from it and, you know, kind of lean into that. If you can look, you see that there is another portrait up here of Captain Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey is one of the individuals we talk about, and he is Wampanoag and African. He is a sailor, and Paul Cuffey and Crispus Attucks, you know, they are a part of Black men who were a large part of the enslaved population. Based on the research that we know that Black men outnumbered enslaved Black women in Boston 3-2, resulting in many children who were born from both Native and Black couples. So again, not just thinking about Indigenous and slavery, but also thinking about the ways in which Black and Native communities are also intertwined. Cuffey, you know, it actually amasses wealth and success as a ship captain and a merchant. And then we know the story of Attucks, who was also a sailor before he was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1775. Next slide, please. So here are some of the other archaeological artifacts that were discovered. And these artifacts actually led to a discovery about enslaved potters. This work was also a part of the MFA exhibit that also opened last year. And that was really essential to actually include it in that exhibit because it mostly focused on enslaved potters in South Carolina. And one of the things that we did with this exhibit was to actually say, hey, there are enslaved potters in New England. So again, we can actually tell this story and make it a very local story as well. And why is that important? Well, I think a part of this is also how we think about the different industries enslaved people are in. We don't often associate enslaved people as a part of, you know, pottery, as making pottery, but actually enslaved enslaved Bostonians worked, I think this also goes to the type of labor that was done. They not only worked in domestic labor or household service, but they were also skilled craftsmen and women. And they were, participated in the army, they were sailors. And so it really does complicate how we think of enslaved labor in Boston. So very quickly, there were several potteries in Boston. These items are coming from Isaac and Grace Parker's pottery, and they were the people who enslaved both Jack and Acton in the 18th century. Their pottery is really important because it's actually all throughout Boston, but not only in Boston. You can find the Parker wares as far south as South Carolina and as far north as Canada. Again, it is amazing to think about how these artifacts allow us to not only talk about the fact that there are enslaved potters who were in Boston, but they're creating everyday wares, things that white colonists are using in their homes every single day. And these items end up in museums as a part of decorative arts. And so what does it mean to kind of turn that story on its head and actually center enslaved people who were making these goods? And when we do that, it really helps us understand how there was no part of colonial Boston that was not impacted by enslaved people, all the way down to the cups and cutlery and bowls that people actually had in their homes. Very quickly, one of the things that I think is also really crucial about Jack and Acton is that the initial research was found by Jared Hardesty to say that there were 2 enslaved men on the Parker's inventory. One of the things for me that's really important is that we don't just talk about enslaved people only through their slavery. And so I was curious in the process of doing this work was, I'm a historian, what else can we find? And so one of the things that we were able to find is that Jack, we know, ends up getting married to a woman named Flora. And they live a whole life together. And so again, oftentimes we're told that, we can't actually trace the lives of enslaved people, but actually when we do that work, when we ask different questions, when we have archaeology, and then, that points us to new places to look, we can start to unpack the world of enslaved people. Naomi, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So one of the other people who we talk about in the exhibit is Chloe Spear. Now, many people are familiar with Chloe because she ends up running a boarding house in Boston after she maintains her freedom. But one of the things that I think is extremely important is that she actually ends up acquiring, not only this property, but she leaves a will. And we don't have many wills from Black women in particular in the 18th century. And one of the things that we're able to do is actually then situate her into a Black community. We know that she was born on the continent around between 1740, 1749, and then was enslaved as early as 1760 by a Boston merchant named John Bradford and his wife. We know that she was a nurse. We know that she was a domestic in their home. And we also know that she was literate, and she actually ended up being threatened with violence by John Bradford because she was learning how to read. So again, it helps us put into context kind of the everyday experience of enslaved people, but this also tells us another thing, that enslaved people, even with the threat of violence, were still, resisting. They were trying to read, they were, becoming literate, and that ended up impacting them greatly. All right, we're back to having technological difficulties, but we are going to keep it moving. So one of the last things that I'll say about Chloe Spear and doing other research about her is that we know where she's living in Boston. Because of that, we know what church she's going to, she ends up living in the North End, and which does have a significant Black population. And by being able to pull out all of the different pieces of these stories, you're able to situate enslaved people in their own communities and tell a new story about their history. So I think from there, the next person that I was going to speak about was Zipporah Potter Atkins, another Black woman who lived in Boston. She's actually a free Black person, which is also really important to also highlight the fact that there is a significant free Black population in Boston at the time. Similar to Chloe Spear, actually, she is extremely significant because she becomes the first Black person to own property in Boston, which is also it's in the North End, which is a part of the Boston Greenway. So again, thinking about these two Black women, one who was enslaved, one who was free, but born to enslaved parents, you see the ways in which they acquire property, you see the ways in which they transition into a post kind of emancipated Boston, and yet and still, for most Black people, they do not have the same experience as Chloe Spear and Zipporah Potter Atkins. In fact, we know that a lot of the Black population, they are struggling to find housing, to have decent, well-paying jobs. They actually end up in places like the workhouse and almshouse for significant periods of time. And so, you know, the exhibit tries to tell a pretty complicated story that tries to engage all of these different aspects of what daily life in Boston looked like for both enslaved and free people. Specifically, one of the things that I wanted to do today was to not really focus too much on the enslavers. It's Black History Month. And so I wanted to pull out the stories of some of the enslaved people that we talk about in the exhibit to really kind of usher us to thinking about their histories, their lives, and what does it mean to commemorate them in a space like Faneuil Hall. Now, some people have said, why Faneuil Hall, given that Faneuil Hall has a very complicated, history. Peter Faneuil is one of the biggest merchants and enslavers in that period, but that's exactly why Faneuil Hall. Most people go into Faneuil Hall, they're greeted with the sign that says it is the cradle of liberty, and the question is always, well, for whom? Because it definitely wasn't the cradle of liberty for Black people in this period. And so again, being able to disrupt that space. When anyone comes into that space, they're no longer allowed to not think about the history of slavery. You can still go and, buy your candy and your t-shirts and your mugs, but you're going to have to walk by the entire exhibit in order to do so. And so that was one of our ways of interrupting that power dynamic. Other people, they have different ways, and I think that that's all important, and we can all work together and think about it. But I think for our team, and specifically, I think, Joe, who had been working on this project for a long time, was being able to get it into that space is such a win. It's such a win for telling the history of slavery in Boston, as it is one of the most trafficked places in the city, and having people really contend with that history. So I'm just going to pause here to see if we can, if Naomi is back.
I just received a text from Naomi. Her computer, she's trying to come back in again. Her computer died on her.
No problem. Let me see if mine will work. Now, technology is just not on our side today, but we're just going to keep rolling. Okay. I'll try to see if
you're doing a great job too. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to see if it'll come back up for me. Can you all see it?
Yes.
All right. I am not going to go ahead and put it in slideshow mode, even though the photos will look better, just so that we don't run into the same issue. So actually, I'm going to pause there and kind of go through a few of these images here to talk about the part of the exhibit that I really worked on the most, which is the legacies of Black radical protests. And we have an image of Mel King, we have an image of Melania Cass, we have an image of an interview that's being conducted for Mothers for Adequate Welfare. And I'm actually going to pause this and I'm going to pull my screen back up to actually show you the timeline and go a little bit more into the thinking of that and why that was really important. Thank you all for being so patient.
Mhm.
Okay, can you see the?
Yes, we're good.
So one of the things during all of the discussions was, how do we bring it back to today? When Laura Roberts and I were in community meetings, I think one of the things that people really pointed out was that they didn't want it to just be a story of violence and violation. As a historian of slavery, I understand how the history of slavery can, really be a hard history to contend with. And one of the things that I didn't want to do was to only talk about the history of slavery without talking simultaneously about Black people's freedom movements that date all the way back to the 18th century. And so a part of the exhibit, when you walk through the physical space, you're greeted with several panels that list a long timeline. And we start in the 18th century, and we talk about a lot of different moments in Black history that are extremely important. I'm gonna focus in on the 1789. Black Bostonians are permitted to use Faneuil Hall for public worship on weekdays, because I think that that's also really important to think about why we're also putting this exhibit in Faneuil Hall, not just connected to Peter Faneuil, who, leaves the money, which he, gets from slavery to build Faneuil Hall, but also Faneuil Hall, by the 18th century, Black people were using that space as well. And so it's also really important to not actually erase that history. And so as a reclamation act, I think in terms of putting the exhibit there, it also points to the fact that Black people have been trying to reclaim that space starting in the 18th century. And that has continued till today, actually, with different community members pushing to rename it. You even have famous Black activists saying, well, Faneuil Hall is our space in the 19th and 20th century. And so we just kind of go through a lot of these crucial moments in Black history and Indigenous history throughout Boston. So going from the 18th century, moving all the way into the 20th century, and really highlighting all of the different ways that Black people are, not only creating social services for themselves. Let's think about schools. Let's think about churches so that they can worship, so that they can make sure that children are educated, but also thinking about, major sit-ins that are happening in the 1960s in order to get adequate resources for Black and Latinx mothers and children in places like Roxbury. So then we move all the way through the 20th century, and then we end on today, and kind of just actually just go through these long histories. And I think it was really, really important for people to also see that Boston has always had a radical activist population, and that Black people were always defining freedom on their own terms at every single moment in history when the city and the state failed them or tried to prevent them from doing so. And again, the entire exhibit is on the website. Joe and his team, they manage it, they update it. People are constantly writing in to send more information. And so it's actually updated in real time. And, given that we've had a little technical difficulties, I'm going to stop there with the technology. And I'm going to end on just one other point, was that we also asked community members kind of what were some of the major issues that they wanted to talk about today. We had small groups at a meeting in Roxbury during the process. And a lot of people came up to me and they said, we want to talk about housing. We want to talk about the lack of job security. These are the things that matter. I have a college degree. Why am I not making enough money? So again, when we're talking about this history, it's really important to always connect it back to the real material lived experiences that Black communities and Brown communities are experiencing today in Boston, which is all the way tied back to that history of slavery. And so we end the exhibit as well talking about the history of redlining, talking specifically about how specific communities in Boston were underdeveloped and the effects that has today still. And we go a little bit into gentrification. And one of the last, I think, stories that I want to bring out was that during one of our public meetings in Roxbury, many community members talked about transportation. And if you live in the state, there's always something going on with the T. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that many communities of color who have to take the T and rely on the T to get to work, if you are in an under-resourced community, you usually have about 2 to 3 transfers before you get to work. So when we're talking also about a person's commute, that also lets us think about the lasting legacy of segregation in this city. And again, how it's impacting people in real time versus if you live in a more resourced community, one, you're most likely driving, or you only have one stop, one transfer during your commute. That makes a huge difference to people in terms of their daily lives. And so I think, again, always thinking about the material conditions of enslaved people and also thinking about how to find descendants throughout this whole process. And there is a running list of all of the people who we know who were enslaved in Boston. And that research is coming from Jared Hardisty's book project. It's coming from 11 Names. It's coming from Abid Alibai's research on slavery in Roxbury. And we're just kind of pulling it all together. So in many ways, it is a real community effort. And I will end there.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Kyera, that was very, very well presented. Thank you, given the technical difficulty that we had. And I'm sure we have some questions. And so can Naomi or Egypt, can you read the questions?
Great. Now, if anyone has any questions, thank you so much, first, Kyera, for that presentation and for you able to work through that with our technical difficulty today. You did that very well. And thank you again for your time. So yes, I would invite anyone today to, if you have a question for Kyera, to put it into the chat. Naomi can read off the questions for you for Kyera, or Kyera, you're welcome to read them off yourself,
Okay.
whichever is comfortable for you.
I think we have a hand from Barbara Brown. Barbara, you're muted.
You're muted.
Kyera, have you considered adding music to the exhibit? We've just discovered, we know that Deaha Musa, one of the enslaved people in Boston, was Muslim. Mm-hmm. And you could add the call to prayer. And I'm sure you can add many other kinds of music. But what that does is it touches people's souls.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I do not think we've had a conversation about adding music or any more content. That really is a Joe question, and I will gladly bring it up with him. I think that it could go for the online exhibit. The physical exhibit is already in place, and so we don't really have any more room unless we can expand it, which would be great. But it's just not a part of the the conversation right now. But I will definitely take that back to Joe and see what he says. I think, yeah, music, poetry, the exhibit does talk about Phyllis Wheatley. We also do have a section on enslaved people and religion. It's very quick. It's about enslaved people wearing, enslaved and free people wearing white. And for me, that was really important to also make sure that we trace that back to West and Central Africa and burial practices and enslaved people's own religious practices. So that is also, there's a small part in the exhibit about that. And I think that those things, you know, help contextualize, but also always remind people that enslaved people had cultures and skills long before their enslavement. And in fact, their skills, their knowledge, their culture was a large portion, a large reason for why they were enslaved. And so I appreciate that. And I'll send a note to Joe after I hop off of this call about that.
Yeah, but Byron Rushing and I are thinking about getting that added to the Boston Athenaeum's exhibit on the Perkins family, because they highlight, unfortunately, Deaha Musa and how much he loved them and how much they loved him.
Yeah, Byron was one of the project advisors too. So he's a good guy.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Bellinger, I see your hands up.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. It really is fleshing out something that when I was teaching, I used to talk to students about the fact that there weren't just these special individuals, Black individuals in Boston, but they were part of a community, in a Black community. And one of the things I would say is also the way in which the porous lines of town borders, that community stretches very far.
Yeah.
Outside of Boston proper. I'm in Lexington, and I see how those communities interacted, and I know Barbara has seen that in Brookline as well. So it's wonderful to have that, and with the work that's going on in all the surrounding communities as well. And I'll just say that with music, that would be a great addition, because there were a number of African-American musicians, particularly fiddlers, in the Boston area, in and around the Boston area. And that would be a wonderful layer to add to it. But thank you so much for that great presentation.
Thank you. And again, I think all of these comments are also really important because, you know, the way that the team understood this exhibit is that it is a living exhibit, that it can be added to, it can be changed in real time. And so being able to hear from people and then go back to the team and, the music is great. So I might be soliciting you to send over the material so that we can add it in.
Naomi, any more? Dr. Gibson. I see Dr. Gibson is.
Yes, the presentation was superb. I'm glad you mentioned about the connection between the African enslaved people and the indigenous people. As a matter of fact, Boston and Massachusetts was the first system of government that suggested that slavery could be legal. It was never legal in England. And in 1641, when they made that decision here, they included Pequot Indians, indigenous people. Governor Winthrop had 2 slaves, and it's thought that both were Pequot Indians. And they used the Pequot Indians to trade in other areas in the Caribbean to get enslaved Black people into this country.
Yep.
And the other thing is that you might look into the fact that perhaps it might be significant to some people who involved with the democracy of America, because they initially, because of a Quaker man named Southwick, who was a Quaker, and some of his offspring, they considered enslaving Quaker women too at that time. But and they didn't do so because of their identity. It would be a difficult thing to do in terms of having them be slaves. But the Quakers were were outsiders, thought to be outsiders because of their abolitionist dispositions. But Mary Dyer, many of you know about her, she was a Quaker woman, and they decided she was a witch because she had a stillborn who had a small head, and that gave them an excuse to torture her. They sent her out of the state initially to Rhode Island and told her not to come back. She did have to hang her, and she did come back in 1860, and they did hang her.
Mhm.
And she was a white woman who was an abolitionist. Her statue is down there around the State House if you wish to look at it sometime. But I think these kind of things ought to be told and known as to how brutal slavery was, and they even included people who were against slavery, that is the Quakers.
I know.
Yeah, those are all amazing points. And I think one of the things that you also highlight is kind of the way in which we understand this history. What are the pervasive myths or the pervasive stories that we tell, and what gets left out? You know, if you go to the Caribbean, there are still, you know, Native communities, like descendants from those, you know, early from that early trade on the Desire. And that's really, really important to always remember. Also thinking about, you know, you brought up the woman who was hanged, and I, you know, in witchcraft. And one of the things that I think is really important too is in the history of colonial Massachusetts, while we talk about women being burned at the stake, the actual fact is that most of the women who were burned at the stake, and there are not that many of them, were in fact Black women. So again, the way that we understand these histories actually, you know, the stories around them, the myth making, oftentimes limit the way that enslaved people are actually at the center of these stories. And I think our goal in doing this work was never just to say, slavery happened, but it's actually to show how foundational slavery was to the development of Boston, but also the state, that we cannot talk about it without talking about slavery. We cannot talk about it without talking about the colonization and forced removal and enslavement of indigenous communities. We can't talk about it without thinking about the trade to the Caribbean, that it is impossible to do such. So thank you for your comments. I think it's really, really important. All right, we have, I think Ken Reeves, you had your hand up, and then Dorothy Clark, and then Barbara.
Yes, I would agree, Kyera, that you have made a wonderful presentation this morning, technical difficulties and all. I'm very interested in the demographic questions of both Black Boston and Black Cambridge from the period of slavery through now. And I might just say a word about the crisis of now, which is that in Cambridge, we have a declining Black population, largely due to gentrification, but also just, you know, people die. And in Cambridge, we have tons of Black 80 and 90-year-olds, but they're coming to an end, and they're not been backfilled, as it were. But I have the demographic concern because there is this sort of supposition that there will always be Black people in Boston and in Cambridge. And I think Cambridge is beginning to understand that that won't necessarily always be, unless we really find some creative measures to make it affordable enough for the Black population to remain. And I'll just give you this one little kernel. So due to COVID, many of the Black churches, which are often the foundation, obviously, of Black communities, during COVID, they went online or they didn't. But post-COVID, try not to name the names, but one of the largest churches has gone from a population of, I'm going to say 750 to 1,000, to now a Sunday morning group of about 60 in the congregation and 50 online, which is a dramatic decrease in numbers. And I think the possibility exists that this is being missed. And so it's very important amongst those of us who are interested in history to understand that the current moment is a very important moment to understand what is happening in our midst as we speak and connect these two things. So I wonder if you say a little more about the demographics of how many people in the overall population in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and then how many in the Black population. And the last thing I was just going to say to Dennis, as you go forward in Egypt with planning, the fascinating stories that exist in places like Jamaica about groups like the Maroons, who you can still visit in a place called a Kampong town. There's plenty of programming awaiting you. And connect the Caribbean and Cambridge and Boston. And there's also this fabulous professor that's at Harvard, who I attended a presentation where he says, well, we think that there are 13 colonies, but there were really 37 colonies, because the 13 colonies were only the ones that were on the North American continent. But when you add the other colonies, which include Jamaica, Barbados, and places like that, you begin to see that the American story about slavery is so inaccurate. So I look forward to future programming that covers these mother loads. But I just go back to the question of demographics. Sorry to go on.
I appreciate
No, I encourage that.
That point on Jamaica. My wife is of Jamaican ancestry, so I get plenty of peas and rice story here. But I say that. But and also our great grandfather is also from Jamaica. But speaking of that, I did want to mention St. Paul's and Charles Street AME Church, both AME churches, which Ken and both myself have been our members. And the history of the AME Church, founding on Beacon Hill, when Charles Street came to relocate in Roxbury, where it is still called Charles Street AME Church, and St. Paul's, which is a combination of African Americans and more people from Caribbean descent, if I'm not mistaken, is a story unto itself, which we do want to touch on, and that's something that we are going to build on as we move forward, and including Jamaica, coming in there somewhere. I did want to mention just a couple of things before, I'm not.
Well, Dad, let her. I think Kyera, see if she had time for a couple with Barbara and Dorothy really quickly. Do you have questions to take one more question before the time in Kyera with? I think Dorothy, did you have one more?
I'll go with Dorothy, and then I'll respond to both Ken and Dorothy at the same time.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Mine is more of a comment, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. And the gentleman who spoke before Ken mentioned the brutality of slavery. History tends to gloss over this. And that's something that I have been thinking about a lot. I teach a world history survey course. And in all my years, finally at this late stage in my life, the word I come to use for slavery is sadistic. And we avoid talking about that. Perhaps that's why it's called difficult history. It's uncomfortable. Okay, thank you.
So I think to respond to both things in terms of the demographics, we know that like in 1720, there are about 1,500 enslaved people living in Boston. It's about 12% of the town's population at the time. As the 1700s continues on, enslaved populations, they kind of fluctuate between 10 and 12%. With Boston being the center of New England slavery, we know that 30% of the region's enslaved people lived in the town. So it's a significant amount of people, and the slave trade was quite prominent. This is when my expertise becomes, very specific. I do not have numbers about Cambridge, unfortunately. So I can't really speak to demographics there, but I'm sure I can find out for you and get back to you about that later. I think in general, thinking about how the Black population changes over time is that we know that enslaved people are moving into the cities, but they're also moving out to other places like Western Mass, and they're also leaving the state. And then we have an influx of Black people coming in again in the 19th and 20th century. 20th century has a lot to do with different immigration policies and job training programs and all different types of that. One of the things I want to stress is that the Black population in Boston is a diasporic one. We literally cannot talk about it without being diasporic. And so I want to be very upfront about that. In terms of today, I think many places are finding that it's just unaffordable. And so what you see is that even if Black families were able to maintain their home, as taxes go up, as people transition, maybe family members cannot quite literally upkeep even just paying the taxes. And so Black communities get pushed out. Often we see it happen all of the time. And then you have people who grew up in cities and towns, and they can't afford to buy a house in the very place that they actually grew up and that their family is from. And so I think it is a real problem. And it's a real problem in Massachusetts, and it's a real problem throughout the country. And when we talk to different community members throughout this process, it was one of the things that was mentioned all of the time in wanting to hold these local and state and city governments accountable for that. And I think the last thing that Dorothy mentioned about slavery and violence and about it being sadistic, I mean, slavery is a brutal institution. In the exhibit, we talk explicitly about scenes of violence and punishment for enslaved people. I kind of kept that out of this presentation today, but it is there. And it's something that we have to sit with, and it's something we have to grapple with. But one of the things that I love about history is that, we often write off violence as something that is just routine. And when we do that, it's actually a problem because we normalize it. And there's nothing normal about the type of violence that enslavers were inflicting on Black people. In fact, it was a part of the logic of enslavement. And when we talk explicitly about that, then we can hold, enslavers accountable for the type of sadism that is existing. But one of the things we can also do is look at the ways in which enslaved people talk about the violence they experience. And when we lean into that, there's an amazing book by Dr. Alexis Wells Agogome, who is a scholar of Black religion. She's at Stanford. She actually uses violence as a category of analysis to talk about enslaved people's experience and to show the ways in which they relied on religion to help them through their enslavement. And it's through talking about these scenes of violence that we get to understand the type of religiosity that existed amongst enslaved people, the type of spirit and deities and orishas, as well as Christianity that enslaved people were utilizing in order to not only make sense of what was happening to them, but also to resist and to survive. And so I think, you know, violence doesn't have to be something that forecloses upon enslaved people's agency. It can also be an opening to thinking about the ways in which enslaved people are talking about the violence they endured, and how they endured it, and also how they resisted it. So I just wanted to end there.
Very good job.
Thank you for that, Kyera. We are coming up over just about an hour. I do want to be respectful for everyone's time. Dad, did you have any other questions before I dismiss everyone
No, I
today?
don't have any questions, but I do have just a couple of quick announcements. Internship. We have an internship available for up-and-coming college student. It is on our website, which I encourage all of you to visit our website, which is www.slaveLegacyHistoryCoalition.org. And on there, there's a wonderful page which was created by my daughter, who was our IT person. It has photographs of everyone who has spoken, or all the events that we have been engaged in over the last couple of years, which are about 50. And if you click on them, you will take you right to the individual's website and give you a background on what they spoke about. So please visit our website at SlaveLegacyHistoryCoalition.org. I did want to mention Deborah Weiss's play at the African Museum, and which is on Phyllis Wheatley, and you should go. I don't have the dates in front of me, but I understand it's a very compelling and interesting play on the life of Phyllis Wheatley. I
think it's March 6th, Dennis.
March 6th. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson.
And so that it will take place, and I encourage you to do that. And again, thank you all. Kyera, that was wonderful, a wonderful presentation. Despite it all, you can't do it.
As always.
Thank you all. Thank you all for having me. And I know that both Joe and Jared would be here if they could. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kyera.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everybody. Yes, and thank you. And also, don't forget our bus trip to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Please join us if you're going to register. We do have a limited number of seats on the bus, so if you're going to join us, please register. There's a registration on our website, and we would certainly welcome all of you. And I know the Massachusetts Historical Society will also welcome all of you. So we look forward to seeing you in March. And thank you so much today. And Dr. Pearson and everyone, Bob.
And I just wanted to remind everyone of our meeting on April the 10th. We will also have Paula Bagger, the president of the Higham Historical Society.
Yes.
So thank you everyone again for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you,
happy
everyone.
Valentine's Day.
Yes, happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you, Dr. Gibson. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone.
Happy
Thank you, Dr. Gibson. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Kyera, thank you.
Thank you always for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyera.
Thank you.